If I asked you what the rarest shiny in Pokemon was, no one will be able to agree. Manaphy, Jirachi, or a specific shiny Spinda might come to mind. But now what about the rarest in each game? Over the years, there's been millions of shinies that have been found, caught, and enjoyed by players. While it's pretty safe to say something like the Gyarados has hundreds of thousands of shinies existing in the world, which Pokemon have the fewest? Which Pokemon are so rare they've almost never been found? I combed through the data of each Pokemon for each game, and found which are the rarest shinies in each Pokemon entry. It's important to know that I'm only counting in-game encounters for this video, so events like the Manaphy egg or the Wishmaker Jirachi won't count towards this. Let's start off with the Generation 1 games. Now, most of you are probably thinking that shinies weren't even added until the Generation 2 games, and you'd be right, almost. Because of how shinies work in the Gen 2 games, shinies are actually determined by specific DVs, which are the game's version of IVs. So if a Pokemon has a 10 defense, 10 speed, 10 special attack, and an attack of 2, 3, 6, 7, 10, 11, 14 or 15, the resulting Pokemon will be shiny. And this also works for transferring Pokemon from older generations. So now we've figured out how to get Gen 1 shiny Pokemon, but what's actually the rarest? The rarest Pokemon needs to be a Pokemon with a low encounter rate and also a low level. The reason for a low level is needed is because at lower levels, DVs don't influence stats as much, so stats don't change every single level. This means it's significantly harder to find a Pokemon with these specific stats, as you need to level them every single encounter to around level 40 to have the data to see whether they're shiny or not. With these two criteria in mind, the rarest shiny Pokemon are Tauros and Kangaskhan. They have a 4% encounter rate in the Safari Zone and is the only way to find one in the whole game. They also appear at only level 26, which is low enough where you can't even tell whether each individual Pokemon is shiny before leveling it up. Now we're on to the Generation 2 games, where shinies are properly added and you can actually see them for the first time. But here's the thing, most shinies in Gen 2 are actually really easy to get, and that's all down to the red Gyarados. In Generation 2, shiny Pokemon can actually bred for massively increased odds at 1 in 64. Every single player is guaranteed a shiny Gyarados at the Lake of Rage, so any Pokemon that can be passed down from the Gyarados can experience the 1 in 64 odds. There's only a few groups of Pokemon that can't be bred from Gyarados, and that's Mineral, Amorphous, and Human-like egg groups. All of these egg groups have absolutely no crossover of any Pokemon that links via egg group to Gyarados. While all these Pokemon are candidates, there are some others, and that's the roaming beasts Entei and Raikou. These two roam through Johto, and whenever you encounter the grass, you have a small chance of encountering them, being a 9.2%. But there's one Pokemon that beats all of these, and that's Ditto. Ditto is the only non-legendary Pokemon in the game that can't be bred at all, since two Dittos can't produce an egg. So unlike the Pokemon in the Mineral, Amorphous and Human-like groups that all have varying wild encounter rates, Ditto ends up being only a 5% encounter rate, which is even lower than the 9.2% of the roaming beasts. Although Ditto is definitely worth it in this game, as I mentioned before, shyness can be passed down through breeding at 1 in 64, and having a shiny Ditto means you can breed any Pokemon. Next up is Ruby, Sapphire and Emerald, where one of the most evil shiny arms was introduced. In the Hoenn games, there's no breeding trick and no shiny charm, there's absolutely nothing. Every single shiny is stuck at 8192 with no way to improve it. So the rarest shiny in this game just comes down to which Pokemon is the hardest Pokemon to find, and that's Feebas. If you've ever tried to catch one in a Hoenn, you know exactly where this is going. Feebas is only found on Route 119, and only by fishing. But out of every water tile in that route, Feebas only spawns on 6 of them. 6 out of the hundreds. The 6 isn't the same for each copy of the game, and you can't tell which tiles are Feebas just by looking at it. So you're stuck fishing tile by tile, hoping you land on the one that works. Half the hunt is pretty much just finding where the Feebas actually spawns, which makes it unique but also really horrible. It is fair to mention that once you find the Feebas tile, it has a 50% encounter rate, and there's an argument that Pokemon like Pinsir and Gligar are actually the rarest, as they both sit around a 5% encounter rate, but in my opinion Feebas is still a bit harder. FireRed and LeafGreen have one of the most legendary shiny hunts from the old shiny hunting community. One that many people have attempted, and that's Safari Zone shiny Chansey. Chansey has between a 1 and 4% chance to be found, but the only locations you can actually find Chansey are in the Safari Zone. In the Safari Zone, Pokemon have a chance to flee after every turn, and Chansey has one of the worst flee rates and catch rates in the game. Alongside its already low encounter rate, it actually makes catching a Safari Zone shiny Chansey over 1 in 4 million. Now we've got Diamond, Pearl and Platinum, and this is like the Feebas hunt, but dozens of times worse. Munchlax is the rarest shiny in these games, and it's not even close. And it's hunted using honey trees. Honey trees are a mechanic that was added in the Generation 4 games. To use them, you have to slather honey on these yellow trees, and 6 hours later a Pokemon will appear on it. You can't skip forwarding your time settings either, and you have to wait an in real life 6 hours. There's another secret mechanic with the trees however, and that's where Munchlax comes in. When you make a new character, 4 of the 21 existing honey trees in the entire game become special honey trees. Nothing visually changes, but they now have a 1% chance for a Munchlax to spawn. There's no telling which of these trees are the Munchlax trees, and unlike Feebas, you aren't even likely to find a Munchlax if you do guess correctly. Alongside that, you have to wait 6 hours between attempts. So even with 4 trees going, you'll still average 150 hours to even start the hunt. HeartGold and SoulSilver are a remake of Gold and Silver, with a few changes related to shiny hunting. The main change is that you can no longer use the shiny breeding method for 1 in 64 shiny chance, which makes shiny significantly rarer across the board. A less major but still important change is how the roaming legendaries work in these games. In Gold and Silver, you can reset outside the grass for the roamers, because their shyness isn't decided until you actually battle them. So despite their low encounter rate, the encounters don't actually take that long. This got reworked in the remakes, and now the shyness is determined the second the cutscene of the dogs leaving the burned tower plays, which massively increases how long each reset takes. And even after that, once you're in the grass, it can still take a few minutes just to find the dog you're looking for. Every time you cross into a new route, the dogs move to an adjacent route, so you have to keep track of going back and forth until you end up on the right route so you can even get an encounter. I originally had Tornadus and Thunderous as the answer here. That doesn't actually hold up once you factor in the Pokédex. With roamers in these games, you can actually check the Pokédex to see whether the one you're tracking is shiny before you even encounter it, which makes the whole hunt a lot faster than it first seems. So instead, the rarest shiny in black and white is Cryogonal. It's found in Twist Mountain and its encounter rate depends on the season, capping out at 5% in winter and dropping to only 1% for every other season. The seasonal restriction isn't a massive deal, since you can just change your system's date to a winter month and hunt at the 5% rate, but still, a 5% encounter rate at full odds with nothing to improve it makes Cryogonal the hardest shiny in this game. Black and White 2 build on from the original Black and White games, and one of the biggest things they added was a much wider range of Pokemon to catch. In the Gen 5 games, patches of grass can shake, signaling a rare Pokemon is inside, and that's where this rare shiny is in these games, Castform. Castform only appears through rustling grass at a 5% encounter rate, so on top of having just a 5% chance to find the Pokemon, you also need to run around and wait for a rustling grass to even spawn. This can add up to minutes between encounters for your hunt, as you have to run back and forth to try and find a rustling grass spot. And that's exactly why I think it's the hardest shiny hunt in all of Black 2 and White 2. Gen 6 is where a lot of modern shiny hunting methods actually started showing up, but it's also the generation where the most things got shiny locked. Between these two things, there aren't actually many options for Pokemon that are left that are both huntable and genuinely difficult. But in my opinion, there is a standout, and it's the same one for both XY and Oras, this little bee. Combee has a 1 in 8 chance of being female, and it's only the females that can evolve into Vespiquen. So if you want a shiny Vespiquen, you're first hunting for a shiny to appear at all, probably through a Masuda method, and then also only a 1 in 8 chance for that Combee to actually be female. This one means a bit to me as well. When I first started shiny hunting, I wanted a real challenge, and one of the biggest shiny hunters at the time, A-Drive, had just found a shiny female Combee through breeding, which is very, very rare, and I wanted to do the exact same thing. Now, if you know much about me, you know I'm very, very lucky when it comes to shiny hunting, and I got the 1 in 8 shiny Combee on my second try, and I still have her to this day. Not much really changes between Sun and Moon and Ultra Sun and Moon when it comes to encounters and these hunts, so I'm going to cover all 4 together. The rare shinies in these games are Goomy and Gibble, and what makes them so difficult is that they're both weather-locked SOS encounters. Goomy only shows up through SOS calls while it's raining at 10%, and Gibble only shows up through SOS calls during a sandstorm. Usually how SOS chaining works is you'll find a Pokemon, you'll get it low, and it'll start calling in teammates. Now, this will usually be the exact same Pokemon that you're fighting, so for example, a Rattata will call in a Rattata. This isn't the case for Goomy and Gibble. They can't call for help themselves, and instead the only way to find them are for Pokemon in these 2 weather conditions to call for help, and you're given a 10% chance for a Gibble or Goomy to come instead. In Pokemon Let's Go, most Pokemon are shiny hunted the same way, through catch combos. I don't want to get too into detail on how these work, as I've already covered it properly in my shiny hunting methods video, but the important part is that catch combos don't work on everything, and that's because not everything can be caught. Fossil Pokemon and Alolan forms are gifted to you, and instead can't be caught in the wild. This means the catch combos won't work, and you're hunting with full odds. In my opinion, Alolan forms slightly edge out the fossils here, since the time between encounters is a bit longer. Also, I'm totally not biased, because I do have a shiny Alolan Ninetales from the game myself. There's one of my favourite hunts ever in Let's Go that almost made the list but doesn't quite fit the criteria, and that's a wild legendary. Legendaries have a very, very small chance to appear in the wild in Let's Go, flying around in the air, and those spawns can be shiny. The reason it doesn't count here is that you can also just soft reset for the legendaries throughout the game, which brings them down to a reasonable hunt. Sword and Shield bring us an entirely new way for people to suffer on specific shiny hunts, and that's variations. Variations of the Pokemon are basically rare, usually 1% alternate forms of a Pokemon that are purely cosmetic. An example of this would be the 3-segment Dunsparce from Scarlet Violet, but Sword and Shield actually did it first with Sinistea. Sinistea has two forms, Antique and Phony. At first glance they look completely normal, but if you check on the bottom of them, a little stamp appears on 1% of Sinistea, showing it's authentic. So to actually get a shiny Antique Sinistea, you're stacking a 1% of the variation on top of the base shiny odds, and you can't breed your way around it either, as breeding will guarantee you get a Phony. This puts a shiny Antique Sinistea at around a 1 in 135,000 in the wild grass, and there's only been a few people who've actually managed to do it. BDSP was announced as a remake for Diamond and Pearl, and they were a little too faithful. Unlike HeartGold and SoulSilver, where they revamped how some mechanics worked, or Rarest, where they overhauled shiny methods completely, BDSP added nothing, apart from the Grand Underground, but who cares? Because of that, the rarest shiny by a mile is still Munchlax, with the exact same mechanics in the original that made it so impossible before. There isn't much more to say, apart from the fact it's technically a little bit easier to find Munchlax, as once you do find the tree, you're working with the 1 in 4096 chance instead of the old 8192. Legends Arceus is some of the best legitimate shiny odds in the entire series. Using mass outbreaks, you can get down to 1 in 128, which is ridiculous odds. But that only works if that Pokemon can actually show up in an outbreak, and Cranidos and Shieldon can't. Fossil Pokemon in this game are locked to space-time distortions, which are random events that only last a short while and can pop up anywhere on the map. You end up having to wait for up to an hour at a time for its distortion, just for a chance for one fossil Pokemon spawning. And if we end up bringing alphas into this, it makes the shiny unfathomably more rare. With an alpha being around a 1% chance on top of the shiny odds, it actually ends up being one of the hardest shiny odds I think ever. Now on Scarlet Violet, and this is where things get stupid. Back in Gen 8 I mentioned variations, alternate cosmetic forms that only show up about 1% of the time. Scarlet and Violet added some more of these, the 3-segmented Dunsparce and the family of 3 Mousehold. With a shiny charm, that makes them around a 1 in 136,000 chance to find, and stacking sandwiches can get that down to around 1 in 50,000. So going off pure odds, these Pokemon should be complete winners, right? In a game where shinies are so incredibly easy, 1 in 50,000 is unfathomable. But I actually think the rarest shiny isn't either of them. It might be controversial, but I'm going to give it to Gimmighoul. Gimmighoul raids were only available 3 separate times ever, and is the only way to find a shiny version. The total amount of time the Gimmighoul raids have been active is 4 weeks, and because of how long each raid takes, even in that 4-week window, your actual number of attempts is very limited. On top of that, the shiny difference on Gimmighoul in the raid is pretty much unnoticeable, so most people opted to just finish the raid every single time to check for the shininess, instead of entering and leaving the raid over and over. And an extra thing is that doesn't really matter, but I think is kind of funny, is that the base odds are actually worse than the normal base odds of any other Pokemon. The worst base odds you can get in Scarlet Violet is 1 in 4096, and for some reason, due to some error, Gimmighoul's shiny chance is 1 in 4103. Obviously, the slight change doesn't have an actual impact on the odds. The main rarity comes from the fact that you can't really hunt it. There is something fair to note, and that's that raids can be shared. During the times Gimmighoul has been raidable, you could find a shiny Gimmighoul raid from someone else, join their raid, and get the Gimmighoul. In my opinion, that's not hunting the Gimmighoul, that's just getting it. I want to know which Pokemon are the hardest to find shiny yourself, not being given it by someone, because we all know if you go on Wonder Trade, there's about a 10% chance you're going to get a shiny hack legendary anyways. Just to defend my point against Dunsparce and Mousehold, the 1 in 50,000 is incredibly rare, but I think the fact that Gimmighoul only has 4 weeks over the entire lifespan of Scarlet Violet, a 4-year-old game, means it is significantly rarer. Last but definitely not least is Legends ZA, and this is the game that makes shiny Pokemon so easy you're unlucky if you don't find a few in your normal playthrough. As most shinies are stupidly easy to find, it doesn't actually leave many options. I'll mention the base game first because there's a fun answer there, and it's fossil Pokemon. The fossil Pokemon are pretty much the only Pokemon that can't be found in the wild, and as fossil encounters aren't affected by the shiny charm, they're stuck at 1 in 4096. The part that makes it interesting isn't just the measly 1 in 4096, it's because they can be alpha. Trying to find an alpha shiny Tyrant, Amora, or Aerodactyl in these games is a 1 in 409,000 chance. and you can technically go further if you're hunting for specifically a female version, which pushes the odds to over 1 in 3 million. It's very fair to note that the Mega Dimension DLC actually does add these fossils in the wild, but as every single Pokemon in this game is just stupidly easy to find shiny, I still think these are the rarest. Nowadays, most shinies can be printed dozens and dozens of times over with these overpowered methods, but even in generations like these, there's still a rarest, a Pokemon at the pinnacle for shiny hunters in that game. While many of these Pokemon will probably be easy to obtain in later games, it's fun to look at the history of shiny hunting and see which Pokemon managed to get their time in the spotlight.